The Red Dead Redemption series is fascinating in a multitude of ways. It is a phenomenal recreation of the end of the Wild West era, full of interesting characters, each of whom have fully developed personalities of their own. The series has an extremely textured story, but what makes the characters so intriguing is the fact that they feel like real people with real lives going on at all times. There is something alluring about the way they talk, the way they carry themselves, along with their unique mannerisms and behaviours. These surely cannot be this way out of thin air, and they definitely aren't, because the Van der Linde gang got up to some wild things in their time. A lot of these moments weren't showcased in the series, but they have been hinted at through conversations and characters. So hold your horses, because we are diving back into the dark history of the Van der Linde gang. The formation of the gang, the 1870s. Sometime in the mid-1870s, a chance encounter between a smooth-talking conman and a petty hustler with a silver tongue marked the formation of the Van der Linde gang. Hosea Matthews was a conman of the highest degree. He could sell someone a plot of land that never belonged to him, yet people would trust him completely. On the other hand, Dutch Van der Linde, the iconic leader of the gang, was more of an idealist. Dutch would sell ideas to people, the promise of a life that was above and beyond their current circumstances, something that would intrigue them into becoming a part of his gang. Of course, when these two met, it wasn't an ordinary encounter. They found each other on the side of the road on the way to Chicago, and Hosea, being the conman, tried his party tricks on Dutch in hopes of robbing him. Dutch did the same to him, and once they learned about how skilled they were both at lying to people, they bonded forever. The boys were a crew now, and their chance encounter would lead to the formation of the Van der Linde gang. Dutch had this idea of redeeming himself and everyone that joined his gang of their sinful past. He wanted to usher them into a new era of outlawry, where he would be a Robin Hood figure for the people. Stealing from the rich, giving back to the poor, that was his ideology, and Hosea was sold on this eventually. In time, their journey led them to the humble town of Kettering in the state of Ohio. Here, the two devised a series of uniquely detailed cons, ones that did not yet involve violence, but was soon to follow eventually. Disguised as traders and businessmen, Hosea and Dutch successfully swindled 12 unsuspecting locals into investing their hard-earned dollars into a fictional Portuguese shipping enterprise, amounting to a grand total of $300. However, their scheme could only remain concealed for so long, and the law eventually caught wind of their deceit. In extracting their own brand of justice, Dutch's idealism of an anarchic world was crumbling because he knew he was the only one being judge, jury, and executioner however he saw fit. At that time, they were stopped by Sheriff Carmichael. He valiantly upheld the principles of law and order in Kettering and exposed Hosea and Dutch's fraudulent activities, leading to their arrest. That wouldn't even make a dent in their escapades though, as the two managed to escape jail in the March of 1877, which is where their dark history truly began. Gathering the troops, 1877 to 1886. After getting out of jail, Dutch had a vision for what he wanted to see. Almost like a cult leader, Dutch had the power to brainwash anyone he came across into believing in his ideologies of hating the rule of law, the government, the state system, and the authorities. He found a young 14-year-old boy named Arthur Morgan in late 1877. Dutch taught him to read, write, and commit crimes in the most terrifying ways. Arthur grew into a brutal lad over the years, and by the age of 20, he was already one of the gang's most powerful assets. Around that point, Hosea became romantically involved with a woman named Bessie, and they fell deeply in love. Meanwhile, Dutch got together with a woman named Susan Grimshaw, who served as a mother figure for Arthur. Hosea's relationship with Bessie had taken a toll on him. He had been struggling to maintain his allegiance to Dutch's vision out of his love for Bessie, and yet his love for the criminal world was something he could just not stay away from. Bessie supported him throughout his struggle, and they kept trying to do their best in both worlds. Around this time, Dutch's fling with Susan Grimshaw had ended, and he had found the true love of his life in a woman named Annabelle. The two loved each other dearly, and their relationship was song-inspiring, something that the gang truly needed in that era of confusion and being lost. Arthur was an unruly child when the gang had found him, stealing from anyone he could find, and he would often receive scrutiny from Dutch, especially the one time where he stole from a poor person's home. Dutch had morals, he was above the everyday petty criminals, and he would only steal from those who were rich so he could give back to the poor. They weren't committing any major crimes at this point, but the gang was growing steadily. The first proper member of the gang was John Marston, a 12-year-old boy who was about to be hung by the authorities for stealing from homesteaders in Illinois. Dutch saved the boy with the help of Arthur and Hosea and took him under their wing. Arthur became the elder brother for John and Dutch became like a father to him. This is where the gang also first encountered Carm O'Driscoll and his gang, where a small rivalry formed due to their conflicting ideologies. Whereas Dutch would steal from only the wealthy, Carm was a monster who would steal from anyone he saw fit. This rivalry would grow much more dangerous over the years, but for the time being, Dutch had to make an impact. And now that they had enough people on their side and Arthur was ready for some thrilling robberies, the gang began their bank robbing spree in 1887. The Robin Hood Gang, 1887 to 1899. This is the lengthiest chapter in the gang's dark history, and this is the point after which most horrific things began to go down. The clock struck 2 as it marked the fateful moment when Hosea and Dutch, along with young Arthur, orchestrated their inaugural foray into the realm of high-stakes robbery. In the darkness of the night, they stormed into the hallowed halls of Lee & Hoyt's banking house, an establishment that had long held the fortunes of the elite, and swiftly seized a fortune worth $5,000 in gold. Their ambitions extended far beyond mere personal gain, and after the robbery, these three wandered around town distributing the gains to the poor and needy. This act had captured the imagination of the oppressed, and it solidified Dutch as a messianic figure in the town. However, it also caught the attention of the authorities, casting Dutch as a wanted man who now had a bounty on his head. After a few more robberies, the boys were travelling around the country looking for different misfits to add to their gang. Around that time, an uneasy truce for the gang with Carm O'Driscoll was broken and the two gangs started a small feud. This didn't worry Dutch too much as they were travelling around and robbing people wildly. However, that calmness didn't last for too long as something happened during the early 1890s which sparked Dutch to get in a fight with the O'Driscolls, resulting in Dutch killing Carm O'Driscoll's brother brutally. Carm O'Driscoll was the type of person to never let a blood feud like this go, and so he chased after Dutch, and when he saw an opening in their defences, he attacked. Carm murdered the love of Dutch's life, Annabelle. She was the woman who kept him grounded, and after Annabelle was gone, Dutch had nothing to lose except for his own sanity and his people. Over time, the robberies kept going and the gang kept growing, with more and more visceral brutality being added to their exploits. The gang tried their hardest to help the poor in their early days, but Dutch's morals were slowly dying as the world became more and more civilized. There were many new members in the gang at this point, and all of them had been rescued by Dutch or Hosea in finding themselves in a tricky position, or by being helpful to the gang in some way. A lot of these were violent men. The Calendar brothers were the most vicious of the bunch. They had violence ensuing with every step they took. At one point, the gang found themselves at crossroads with a town named Deer Creek, and Mac threatened to kill every person in the town during the encounter. Along with Tilly Jackson, Simon Pearson, Karen Jones, Mary Beth Gaskill, Orville Swanson, Uncle, Sean Maguire, Hosea Trelawney, Molly O'Shea, Bill Williamson, and an unnamed member who we will talk about in a minute. The most notable thing that happened during those early years of their robbing, however, was when Abigail Roberts was first brought to the fold by Uncle in 1894. Abigail was a prostitute who had sexual relations with many of the males in the gang, but she eventually found a stable relationship with John Marston, one of the core members of the gang. This led to the birth of Jack Marston, a boy who was first raised by the gang for the first year of his life, as John rejected taking any responsibility for the kid when he was born. After a bit of time during that era, Dutch's paranoia grew rampant, and he didn't have Annabelle to keep him grounded, and Miss O'Shea didn't feel like true love to him. The robberies they were committing had more and more violence included with them, with lawmen constantly dying at their hands as the bounty on Dutch's name kept rising. An unnamed member of the gang was suspected of betraying the gang during that time, which led to the Pinkertons chasing after them all. After a bit of investigating on Arthur and Hosea's part, they eventually caught onto the member's betrayal. The gang brutally murdered the traitor at their camp, and yet they did not regret it for even a moment. On the topic of Jack Marston, John argued that there was no surety of the kid being his, and eventually he left the gang. John's departure hit everyone hard, especially Arthur, who had grown resentful with him for not only betraying those that saved him from certain death when he was a child, but also for just being a terrible father like his own father had been. John eventually returned a year later, and that is when things started to go south even faster, as the gang headed to Montana's Grizzlies while on the run from the Pinkertons, an elite force created to cleanse the West from any outlawry still remaining. On the run from the authorities, the gang had found themselves traveling from place to place, picking up more members such as Lenny Summers, Charles Smith, Jenny Kirk, and finally, the most brutal of them all by far, Mika Bell. This was an era of fear for them all. They were being pressured into a wall, and Dutch had to do something to make sure that they all survived. Their survival was of the utmost importance to him, and this is where his idea of a big final score came into existence. The demise of the Van der Linde gang, 1899. The gang had found themselves out of the Grizzlies and into the state of West Elizabeth. This was a growing country and, in the mind of Dutch, being disgraced by the powers of industrialization. They camped outside a small town named Blackwater, and here they would try to commit their biggest and most notorious job of all. Mika had found a lead regarding a riverboat that was carrying piles upon piles of cash from the local bank. Dutch was interested from the first moment. He wanted a big final score before they could all be free from this life. But Arthur and Hosea knew something was very wrong with this very job. Dutch did not listen, and the robbery was a go. The gang's meticulously crafted heist spiraled into an unforeseen tempest of tragedy. This was to be the most brutal event they were ever going to witness. As the gang descended on the ferry, they had found that there were Pinkertons almost everywhere. It was a setup, and Dutch had been fooled. Something happened during that heist, where Dutch shot an innocent woman named Heidi McCall in the face, destroying it with his high-caliber revolvers. It's implied that Dutch was spurred on by Mika during the heat of the moment, but the true intentions of this killing are still quite vague, and they won't be cleared up for a long time. However, what is clear were that the casualties that the Van der Linde gang faced, having a huge amount of their firepower absolutely decimated. The first one to be injured during the fight was Mac Callender, who was wounded by a gunshot to the gut, and later he was tortured by the Pinkerton agent Andrew Milton for details regarding the gang. After the fight on the ferry, a chase ensued which resulted in many members getting wounded. Mac's brother, Davey, suffered the worst hits of all, getting shot in the vital organs and being almost completely paralysed by the pain. Jenny Kirk was also shot, and she succumbed to her injuries much quicker than anyone else. The last person who was injured was John Marston. Fortunately, Marston's injuries were quite minor compared to the rest, but it did render him quite useless for a solid few days nonetheless. The gang had also lost Sean Maguire during the commotion, but he managed to sneak himself out of trouble and into the hands of the bounty hunters, from which he was rescued half a year later. The overflow of power had corrupted Dutch's mind, and his overgrowing confidence knew no bounds. He felt as if he could do anything he wanted, but that wasn't true. The gang's dark history had caught up to them on several occasions, from Annabelle's death, to being betrayed by the unnamed member, to the Blackwater ferry heist, the St. Denis fiasco which resulted in Hosea and Lenny's death, along with the eventual fallout that happened years later. It's almost as if Dutch knew that nothing would go according to plan, and yet his ego kept him going in that path. The dark history of the Van der Linde gang was full of brutality and crime. This gang was almost on the same level of evil as the rest of them, and the only difference was that Dutch's own ideals were what held them intact, despite him forgetting most of them. At the end of the day, their past caught up with them, and every sinful thing that they did would come back to bite them.